She wasn't under arrest for a mistake. She was under arrest for telling the truth. Diana learned very quickly that house arrest was not about confinement. It was about permission. The company had not locked her inside the apartment to isolate her from the world. It had done so to redefine what the world was allowed to look like. The door opened only when it was scheduled to open. The internet worked only well enough to be monitored. The bracelet on her ankle did not tighten or shock or blink aggressively, which made it worse. It simply existed, recording compliance with indifferent precision. Diana could walk from the kitchen to the living room, from the living room to the bedroom, from the bedroom back to the table where the reports were stacked like a quiet accusation. Freedom had been reduced to geometry. She stopped thinking in days after the first week. Days implied progress. What she had instead was repetition. Every morning began with the same routine. Checking the battery on the bracelet, opening the curtains exactly halfway, turning on the laptop and reconnecting to the company's internal system that she technically no longer had access to, but was still expected to reference. They wanted her present enough to cooperate and powerless enough to comply. The apartment itself had changed character. It no longer felt like a personal space. It felt like a controlled environment, a place where behavior could be measured and later interpreted by people who had already decided on the outcome. Diana sat at the table and reread the same financial models she had built months earlier, long before the word investigation entered any conversation. Back then, the numbers had been abstract, elegant, obedient. Now they were sharp. Now they pointed. She knew exactly which structure had been designed to fail, which subsidiary had been hollowed out to absorb losses, which executive signature appeared just often enough to claim ignorance later. She also knew why she had been chosen as the problem. She was not loud. She was not political. She was precise. And precision left traces. At 9:04 a.m., the lock disengaged. The sound was clean, manufactured to feel non-threatening, like the click of a hotel door rather than the seal of a controlled perimeter. Diana did not stand immediately. She stayed seated, letting the seconds stretch, forcing the person outside to wait just long enough to register that this was not a meeting on their terms alone. When she opened the door, the man standing there did not look like security and did not look like legal counsel. He looked like something in between. Caspian introduced himself using only his first name, which was not an attempt at familiarity, but a signal that hierarchy was flexible when it needed to be. He did not carry a briefcase. He did not ask for permission to step inside. His eyes moved through the apartment with trained neutrality, cataloging exits, surfaces, posture. He explained calmly that he had been assigned by the company to assist her during this transitional period. He spoke about alignment, cooperation, minimizing damage. He did not mention arrest, charges, or wrongdoing. Diana noticed that omission immediately. People who believed in guilt named it. People who managed risk avoided the word entirely. She asked him who exactly had assigned him. He said the company again, as if repeating it added legitimacy. She asked whether he worked for legal, compliance, or crisis management. He said his role adapted to the situation. That answer told her more than a title would have. Caspian sat only after she gestured to the chair, and even then, he positioned himself at an angle that allowed both observation and exit. He spoke about contracts she had signed years ago, about confidentiality clauses that survived termination, about financial penalties that escalated quickly when cooperation lapsed. Diana listened without interrupting. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when they believed they were being heard. When he finished, she stood, walked to the table, and slid a single document toward him. She did not frame it as evidence. She did not argue. She simply pointed to one number, a variance so small that only someone deeply familiar with the system would notice it, and so consistent that it could not be accidental. Caspian leaned forward despite himself. His eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with calculation. He asked how she had derived the figure. It was not the question of someone trying to disprove her. It was the question of someone trying to understand how much trouble they were actually in. Diana answered clinically. She explained the methodology, the assumptions, the internal approvals that had passed through 3 departments without resistance. She watched his expression change, just slightly, when he realized the implication. This was not a rogue employee error. This was architecture. Caspian straightened and reminded her that interpretations could vary, that intent was difficult to prove. Diana agreed. Intent was always difficult to prove. Outcomes were easier. She told him she had not altered anything. She told him there were original files stored outside the company system. She told him that if this proceeded the way the company wanted, it would not end quietly. Caspian warned her that non-compliance would trigger severe contractual consequences. Diana corrected him calmly. Those consequences assumed the company remained intact long enough to enforce them. The air between them sharpened. This was no longer a scripted consultation. This was a negotiation neither of them had expected to conduct. Caspian stood, smoothing his jacket, and told her to think carefully about her next steps. Diana met his gaze and told him she already had. When the door closed and the lock re-engaged, the apartment felt smaller than before. In the hallway, Caspian checked his phone. A message from his employer waited, asking for his assessment. Inside, Diana returned to the table, her pulse steady, her mind already moving ahead. The company had not sent a savior. It had sent a handler. And handlers were dangerous not because they lied, but because they could recognize the truth and still decide it was expendable. Caspian did not report immediately. That alone was unusual. In his line of work, speed was currency, and silence created suspicion. He walked 3 blocks before stopping, letting the city noise overwrite the apartment's controlled quiet. Diana's number replayed in his head, not as data, but as pattern. He had seen mistakes before. He had seen incompetence, negligence, even deliberate sloppiness disguised as chaos. What she showed him was none of that. It was clean. Too clean. The kind of deviation that only appeared when someone understood exactly how much distortion the system could tolerate without triggering alarms. Caspian unlocked his phone and drafted a neutral summary, deleting it twice before saving anything. Inside the apartment, Diana replayed the meeting from her side with equal precision. She cataloged his pauses, the way his eyes lingered on the document, the specific question he had asked. Not whether it was legal, not whether it was allowed, but whether it was consistent. That mattered. It meant he understood systems, not just consequences. The company sent people like him when it wanted outcomes, not justice. 2 hours later, her laptop chimed with an automated compliance check. A reminder, polite and impersonal, that her activity logs would be reviewed. Diana closed the report and opened a neutral file, aware that even stillness could be interpreted as resistance. When Caspian returned that afternoon, it was unannounced but authorized, the kind of visit that looked routine on paper and invasive in practice. He did not bring new threats. He brought questions. Careful ones. Hypothetical ones. He asked how long she had noticed the discrepancy. He asked who else might have seen it. He asked whether she had discussed it with anyone outside the company. Diana answered selectively. She gave him timelines without names, processes without locations. She watched him adjust in real time, recalibrating his internal model of her. This was no longer a fragile executive under pressure. This was someone who had anticipated collapse and prepared for it. Caspian mentioned, almost casually, that the company believed external auditors might complicate matters. Diana corrected him. External auditors would clarify matters. That was the point. He looked at her then, really looked, as if recalculating the role he had been assigned. He asked for access to the underlying model. Diana refused without raising her voice. Not yet. The refusal hung between them, not hostile but definitive. Caspian did not push. That restraint was new. Later, alone again, Diana checked the battery on her bracelet and noted the slight delay in synchronization. A small thing. Too small to report. Small enough to notice. Meanwhile, Caspian sat in his car reviewing the internal message he had finally received from his employer. The instructions were clearer now. They wanted containment, not analysis. They wanted her to sign, to accept responsibility, to close the loop. The discrepancy she had shown him was dismissed as interpretive noise. That dismissal made his jaw tighten. Noise did not repeat itself with mathematical elegance. He realized then that his phone, resting quietly in his palm, was warmer than it should be. Not from use. From activity. Caspian powered it down slowly, deliberately, and left it that way longer than necessary. Back upstairs, Diana stood by the window, watching the city continue without her. She did not trust Caspian. Trust was premature and dangerous. But doubt had shifted. Not hers. His. And doubt, in the right place, was leverage. When he returned the following morning, his tone was different. Less directive. More exploratory. He asked if she believed the company would sacrifice her to protect the structure. Diana answered honestly. Yes. He asked if she believed he had been hired to facilitate that outcome. Diana paused, then said she believed he had been hired to manage whatever outcome cost the least. That answer unsettled him more than accusation would have. Caspian glanced at the ceiling, at the corners of the room. At nothing in particular. Then he asked her to show him the number again. She did. This time, he did not ask questions. He simply nodded once. The shift was subtle, almost invisible, but irreversible. Caspian had not chosen her side yet. But the company's version of reality had cracked. And once cracked, it would never sit cleanly in place again. Caspian noticed the surveillance the same way he noticed everything else that mattered, indirectly. Not through a warning or a message, but through a delay that did not belong. His phone vibrated once, stopped, then vibrated again a fraction of a second later, as if two systems were arguing over who had the right to notify him first. He did not look at the screen immediately. He finished the sentence he was reading, locked the document, and only then checked. Nothing visible. No alerts. No incoming calls. That absence confirmed it more clearly than any technical flag. They were listening passively now, not interfering, which meant the decision phase had begun. In Diana's apartment, the air had changed again. Not in temperature or sound, but in pressure. She felt it before she could articulate it, the way you feel a storm long before it arrives. Caspian spoke less during that visit. He asked fewer questions, and the ones he did ask were too precise to be innocent. Diana answered, equally precise, equally careful. When he mentioned the company's intent to schedule a formal statement within the week, she did not react. She had already assumed as much. What mattered was how quickly they were accelerating. Acceleration meant fear. At one point, Caspian's phone buzzed on the table between them. The sound was sharp, intrusive. Diana's eyes flicked to it despite herself. Caspian did not pick it up. He turned the device face down with deliberate slowness, as if the movement itself were a decision. He continued speaking, but the rhythm was off, half a beat slower. Diana noticed. She noticed everything now. When he stood to leave, he did something unexpected. He pulled a pen from his pocket, tore a small piece of paper from a legal pad on the table, and wrote 3 words. Not a name, not a warning. We are heard. He slid the paper toward her without comment. Diana stared at it, then up at him. This was not reassurance. It was a line being drawn. Caspian left without waiting for a response. In the hallway, he did not check his phone. He walked until the building was behind him and only then allowed his breath to release. Inside, Diana folded the paper once and tucked it into the sleeve of the report. Her pulse was steady, but her thoughts sharpened. If they were listening now, then everything had shifted. Conversations were liabilities. Silence was camouflage. That evening, Caspian removed his phone battery and left the device in his kitchen drawer, powered down and inert. He used a secondary line to contact an old acquaintance in compliance, asking questions framed as hypotheticals, careful not to leave a trail that could be traced back to Diana. Each answer he received confirmed what he already knew. The company was preparing to close ranks. Someone needed to absorb responsibility, and she was the cleanest option. Meanwhile, Diana began moving information in ways that looked like nothing. She renamed files, changed access patterns, introduced small inconsistencies designed to confuse automated tracking without triggering alerts. She worked slowly, methodically, aware that haste would be interpreted as panic. When Caspian returned 2 days later, he did not sit. He leaned against the wall instead, keeping distance from surfaces most likely to be monitored. He spoke about procedure, about the optics of resistance. Diana listened, then reached into her folder and removed a single sheet of paper. She did not hand it to him. She placed it on the table and stepped back. Caspian approached, careful not to touch it at first. The document was not explosive on its own. It was connective, a missing link, enough to suggest intent if paired with the right data set. Caspian felt the weight of it settle somewhere behind his eyes. This was no longer about advising a client. This was about choosing whether to participate in erasure. He looked at Diana and said nothing. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his pen, and crossed out a line on the paper, marking a correction that only someone deeply familiar with the system would. Notice, he did not explain it. He did not justify it. He simply folded the paper and handed it back to her. In that small, silent act, the decision was made. Caspian would not confront the company directly. Not yet. He would not declare allegiance. That was too loud, too clean. Instead, he would misdirect, delay, obscure. He would become a variable they could not fully account for. Diana accepted the paper, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. Neither acknowledged it. Trust did not bloom. It did not soften. It locked into place like a mechanism engaging. From that moment on, every word spoken aloud was performance. Every real decision happened elsewhere. And somewhere in the company's monitoring systems, an algorithm flagged a growing irregularity it could not quite define. Night erased the illusion of normal oversight. The building quieted into a controlled hum, the kind that came from systems running unattended rather than people sleeping. Diana turned off the main lights and left only the desk lamp on, angled so that it illuminated the table but left the corners of the room in shadow. Caspian watched the change without comment. He understood why she did it. Cameras liked light. Shadows created ambiguity, and ambiguity slowed interpretation. They worked without speaking at first. Diana accessed old directories through layers of archive permissions she had memorized years ago when she still believed longevity inside the company was a form of security. Caspian stood close enough to see, but not close enough to crowd her, pointing only when absolutely necessary, careful not to touch the keyboard himself. Touch created fingerprints. Fingerprints created narratives. The files they were looking for were not labeled in any meaningful way. The company had learned long ago that secrecy was best achieved through banality. The originals were buried among drafts, outdated projections, and incomplete models that looked like abandoned work. Diana navigated them patiently, cross-referencing timestamps, noticing which entries had been altered just enough to sever continuity. Caspian broke the silence once, explaining how internal investigations framed inconsistencies. He did not speak in absolutes. He spoke in tendencies, in patterns of questioning, in the way interrogators leaned into fatigue rather than accusation. He told her never to volunteer context. Let them ask. Let them define the scope. Information given freely was always reinterpreted as confession. Diana absorbed it, nodding once, her eyes never leaving the screen. She asked him what they would do if the originals were gone. Caspian answered honestly. Then they would prove absence. Proving erasure was sometimes easier than proving existence. Hours passed. The lamp grew hot. Diana's shoulders tightened, her posture rigid from concentration. Caspian noticed and adjusted the chair behind her without asking, lowering it slightly so she could lean back without breaking line of sight to the screen. The gesture was practical, not intimate, but it lingered longer than necessary. At one point, Diana's hand stopped moving. Caspian saw it before she said anything. Fatigue had reached the stage where mistakes became likely. He told her to step away for 5 minutes. She resisted instinctively, then complied. In the kitchen, she poured water and leaned against the counter, her breath shallow. Caspian stood nearby, not crowding, explaining in a low voice how questioning worked when someone was exhausted, how investigators waited for that moment to push harder, to offer relief in exchange for clarity that could later be weaponized. Diana listened, then surprised him by asking how he knew all this. Caspian hesitated, then said only that he had been on both sides of the table. That answer satisfied her more than detail would have. When they returned to the table, they found what they had been circling for hours. A directory that should not have existed anymore. Original files, unaltered, their metadata intact. Diana did not react outwardly. She simply copied them to an encrypted drive she had prepared weeks ago, long before Caspian arrived, long before she allowed herself to imagine help. Caspian watched the progress bar with an intensity that surprised him. This was the first tangible proof that the company's version of events could be dismantled. When the transfer completed, neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer tense. It was concentrated. Caspian explained the next step carefully. How to respond if summoned. How to answer without aligning to their framing. He ran her through hypothetical questions, changing variables, pushing her to respond under pressure. Diana adapted quickly, adjusting tone, learning when to pause, when to deflect. She was not defensive. She was controlled. Somewhere past midnight, the building creaked as heating. Systems adjusted. Diana realized she was sitting closer to Caspian than before, their shoulders nearly touching as they reviewed the final checklist. She did not move away. He did not either. The proximity was not about desire. It was about shared risk compressing space. When they finally shut the laptop, the night felt heavier, fuller. They had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Caspian gathered his things, then paused at the door. He told Diana to memorize one rule above all others. Never contradict herself, even if the truth changed shape. Consistency would protect her longer than honesty. Diana nodded. When the door closed behind him, she remained at the table, the encrypted drive warm in her hand. For the first time since the arrest began, she did not feel alone inside the containment. She felt accompanied by someone who understood the cost of survival inside systems built to consume people quietly. The attempt to make Diana sign came disguised as courtesy. Two company lawyers arrived within the approved window, polite, unhurried, carrying folders that looked deliberately light, as if the weight of what they contained would be psychological rather than physical. Diana recognized the tactic immediately. They spoke about resolution, about restoring stability, about the benefits of closing a chapter cleanly. Caspian stood slightly behind them, positioned so that he could observe without being framed as an equal participant. His presence alone was meant to suggest inevitability. One of the lawyers placed the document on the table and slid it toward Diana with a practiced smile. It was a confession without the word confess. Language crafted to accept responsibility without naming guilt, to imply cooperation without granting protection. Diana read it slowly, aware of the cameras, the bracelet, the silent algorithms measuring hesitation. She looked up and asked a single question about a clause buried near the end. The lawyer answered smoothly, incorrectly. Caspian noticed. That error was not accidental. It was bait. The document was designed to be signed quickly, before analysis could catch up to implication. Diana closed the folder. She said she needed time. The lawyers exchanged a look that was too synchronized to be spontaneous. One of them reminded her that refusal could be interpreted as noncompliance. Caspian intervened then, not loudly, not aggressively, but enough to shift the dynamic. He suggested a short recess, citing procedural prudence. The lawyers resisted, then conceded. In the hallway, Caspian leaned in just enough to speak without triggering directional microphones. He told Diana they were accelerating because something upstream had shifted. The window for controlled exit was closing. He did not use the word escape. He didn't need to. Back inside, Diana nodded once. She had already prepared for this possibility, not emotionally, but structurally. When the lawyers returned, she asked to use the restroom. The request was routine, human, difficult to deny without appearing coercive. Caspian positioned himself between them and the door as she passed, creating a brief, unremarkable obstruction that allowed her to reach the bedroom. There, she slipped the encrypted drive into the lining of her jacket and switched the bracelet to backup mode, a function meant for maintenance checks, not movement. The timing had to be exact. Caspian glanced at his watch, then deliberately knocked a stack of papers off the table, apologizing as he knelt to gather them. The distraction lasted 11 seconds. It was enough. Diana exited through the service stairwell, her steps measured, not rushed. Panic drew attention. Control dissolved it. Outside, the city felt louder, sharper, as if sound itself had weight. Caspian joined her 3 minutes later, having created a plausible administrative delay. They did not speak until they were 2 blocks away. Only then did Caspian exhale fully. He told her the lawyers would notice within minutes. She told him she had anticipated that. The risk bound them together more tightly than any promise could have. They moved through side streets, avoiding cameras where possible, following routes Caspian had memorized long ago when he still believed contingencies were theoretical. Diana's heart pounded, not with fear, but with clarity. This was not flight for its own sake. This was repositioning. When they finally stopped, tucked into the anonymity of a crowded street, Caspian looked at her and nodded once. They had crossed another line. This time, it was irreversible. The company would not frame this as misunderstanding. It would frame it as defiance. And defiance demanded response. Diana felt the weight of it settle, not crushing, but galvanizing. Whatever came next, they would face it outside the controlled environment. Together, not by agreement, but by necessity forged in motion. The drive hummed quietly under Diana's jacket, a subtle vibration that echoed the tension coiled in her chest. Caspian led her through narrow streets, carefully avoiding the main avenues where cameras and patrols could spot them. Every step was deliberate, measured, but the rhythm of the city around them gave a strange sense of camouflage. They approached the old archive building, a sturdy brick structure with a service door that looked unused for years. Caspian had studied its schedule meticulously, patrol rotations, camera blind spots, even the patterns of occasional delivery trucks. "Follow my lead exactly," he whispered. "We have a short window to get in, copy the files, and get out without triggering anything." Inside, the air smelled of dust and varnish. Fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, and shadows danced across shelves filled with binders, boxes, and loose documents. Diana's analytical mind worked at full speed, checking metadata, dates, and file labels against memory. Caspian moved with controlled efficiency, scanning the room, adjusting their path when a distant motion sensor blinked. Time stretched, each second amplified by the weight of potential discovery. When the correct boxes were finally located, they began copying the files to the encrypted flash drive Caspian had prepared. Their coordination was seamless, almost instinctual. Every movement, every glance spoke volumes. This was no longer a simple mission. It was a test of trust, a silent negotiation of risk. Every second felt like a physical weight, the silence of the archive amplifying the frantic data transfer as they listened for any sound of a returning patrol. Once the progress bar hit 100%, Diana pulled the drive, and they began their exit immediately, using back corridors and pre-planned blind spots. The city was quieter now, early morning light beginning to touch the tops of buildings, yet they moved as if night still held them. Every shadow, every distant sound, was scrutinized, yet their movements were smoother, more confident than at any previous stage. For Diana, the night had become a lesson in trust and judgment, the fine balance between risk and strategy. Caspian, silent but aware, guided her through the streets with a precision that masked the adrenaline still pumping through their veins. By the time they stepped onto a broader avenue, leaving the archive behind, they shared a brief look of acknowledgement, a wordless promise that the alliance forged in danger had deepened. The envelope with the check remained untouched, a reminder that choices mattered and that not every opportunity was worth accepting. The files were theirs, the risk survived, and the path ahead, though still perilous, was slightly clearer than before. The city still carried the muted hum of early morning, streets gradually waking, lights reflecting off wet pavement from an earlier drizzle. Diana walked beside Caspian, every sense alert, every movement calculated. Their path took them through alleyways, service entrances, and quiet side streets, places the city seemed to forget existed. They moved through the gray morning light, avoiding the growing crowd of early commuters. Each block felt longer than the last, the physical exhaustion of the night finally catching up to them as they navigated the final perimeter toward the safe house Caspian had established in a quieter district. Diana's muscles ached. Her mind raced with the events of the night. Caspian watched her, noting the tension in her jaw, the tight line of her shoulders. He said nothing, simply handed her a bottle of water, the gesture small but deliberate, an acknowledgement of care and attentiveness. Diana accepted it, her fingers brushing his for a heartbeat longer than necessary. She felt the subtle warmth of human presence, a stark contrast to the sterile corporate world they had been navigating. For the first time in hours, the tension between them shifted, not gone, but transformed into mutual awareness. They spoke quietly, exchanging minimal words, locations, surveillance patterns, next steps. Every sentence, every glance, was a negotiation, a reinforcement of their shared goal. Caspian outlined a route to continue their investigation, emphasizing patience, precision, and the necessity of remaining unpredictable. Diana absorbed each detail, her analytical mind evaluating risk, probability, and timing. They were no longer just two individuals surviving the night. They had become a coordinated unit, instincts honed to the same rhythm, awareness of each other integrated into every movement. When they resumed walking, the city felt different. Every shadow, every distant sound, was still a potential threat, but now they moved with a quiet confidence born from shared action and trust earned under pressure. At one point, Diana stumbled slightly on a loose cobblestone. Caspian's hand brushed her arm instinctively, steadying her. It was a fleeting contact, yet it resonated more than any words could. She realized that beneath the professional exterior, beneath the cynicism, he had shown consistent judgment, loyalty, and care. They passed a corner where a group of early pedestrians emerged. Caspian adjusted their pace, merging seamlessly with the flow, his presence protective but unobtrusive. Diana felt a new layer of reliance forming, not born of obligation, but of recognition. They were safer together, their combined skill and awareness creating an advantage no single individual could match. Hours passed in cautious movement, careful observation, and minimal interaction, yet the unspoken bond strengthened. By the time they paused near a quiet cafe, just beginning to open for the morning, the weight of the night and archive mission seemed momentarily lighter. Caspian checked the surroundings one last time, then looked at Diana. "We move tomorrow," he said simply. No explanation needed. They both understood. Survival, investigation, strategy, they were intertwined now. Diana allowed herself a small nod, a wordless acknowledgement that the night had changed the dynamic between them, that trust had been forged under pressure, and that, for the first time, she did not feel completely alone in navigating the danger that lay ahead. They found refuge in a small, dimly lit apartment that Caspian had scouted the previous week, a safe spot away from the city's main arteries, cameras, and patrols. The faint hum of traffic from the street below was a distant reminder that life continued beyond their tense, secretive existence. Diana set the encrypted flash drive on the worn wooden table, staring at it like a talisman of both danger and hope. She reached down and adjusted the metal band on her ankle. It was cold, inert in its backup mode, but it remained a constant, heavy reminder that her freedom was currently an illusion, one that would shatter the moment the company's servers synchronized and flagged her missing location. Caspian remained near the window, arms crossed, eyes scanning the street intermittently, but there was a tension in his jaw that Diana had rarely seen. She noticed it, registering that beneath his composed exterior, the weight of decisions and consequences pressed heavily upon him. Then her gaze fell upon the small envelope Caspian had left beside the drive. She picked it up cautiously, hands trembling slightly. Inside was a crisp check, an offer from the company, generous enough to tempt nearly anyone, a bribe to betray her, to abandon their joint mission. Diana's chest tightened. She looked up at Caspian, searching for a trace of deceit, a hint that he might have already taken it, cashed it, or even considered doing so. His expression remained calm, almost neutral, but she sensed the tension in his posture, the tightness around his shoulders. "Is this real?" she asked softly, her voice measured but edged with suspicion. Caspian stepped closer, keeping his voice low, deliberate. "It's real. They hoped it would make me abandon you, make me turn against the evidence. But I didn't take it. I haven't considered it. The choice isn't for them. It's for me, for principle." Diana's mind whirled. Her trust had been tested before, constantly, but this tangible object, the check, made the moral stakes undeniable. She realized how much Caspian risked simply by staying aligned with her. Any misstep, any exposure, could destroy his career, his reputation, perhaps even his freedom. Yet he had chosen loyalty, risk, and shared purpose over personal gain. For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the night and the moral complexity of the situation pressing in from all sides. Diana felt a swirl of emotions, suspicion, admiration, tension, and a faint stirring of something deeper that she was reluctant to name. Caspian finally spoke again, his tone quiet, almost intimate. "I can't make you trust me. I can only show you where my loyalty lies. Everything else is your choice." She nodded slowly, placing the check back on the table, untouched. That single act was more than refusal. It was acknowledgement, recognition of his integrity under pressure. Caspian's eyes softened ever so slightly, an imperceptible crack in the carefully constructed armor he always wore. They spent the next hours preparing for the next phase of their plan. Every document was checked, every route planned, every possible variable considered. Diana absorbed Caspian's guidance on how to navigate confrontation, surveillance, and interviews, while he adapted to her analytical approach, incorporating her insights into his strategy. Their partnership evolved from necessity into coordination, a silent, intuitive understanding of each other's capabilities and instincts. By the time the first streaks of dawn crept across the city skyline, The apartment felt less like a refuge and more like a command center. The danger outside was undiminished, but within these walls, they had created control, precision, and alignment. For Diana, the check had been a catalyst, a symbol of the moral complexity surrounding them, but also of the depth of Caspian's loyalty. She realized that trust, once fragile and conditional, was now anchored in action, risk, and shared understanding. The day ahead would bring confrontation, exposure, and potentially chaos, but for the first time, Diana felt a quiet certainty. They were aligned, prepared, and, despite the moral labyrinth they navigated, they were not alone. And in that fragile moment of clarity, Caspian's hand brushed hers, a fleeting, subtle gesture that spoke more than words ever could. They were partners, in strategy, in risk, and perhaps in something yet unnamed, something human and real. By midday, Diana and Caspian had reached the edge of the corporate complex, blending into the flow of employees, contractors, and service personnel. The early morning tension had shifted into a focused intensity. They were no longer fleeing. They were infiltrating, armed with evidence, strategy, and a plan refined over nights of preparation. Caspian had secured temporary access credentials through a contact within the administration, someone disillusioned by the executive corruption and eager to aid the truth. Diana carried the encrypted flash drive carefully, as though it were both a shield and a weapon, while Caspian kept watch, eyes scanning every entrance, every security camera, every approaching figure. They moved silently through hallways that once had seemed imposing, now familiar in their methodical navigation. The boardroom loomed ahead, glass walls reflecting the sterile lighting and the city beyond. The head of the board, the CEO, and several high-ranking executives were already seated, the air thick with authority, arrogance, and expectation. Caspian paused at the door, exchanging a brief glance with Diana, a silent acknowledgement of shared responsibility and mutual trust. Then, with a composed step, they entered. The head of the board looked up, surprise flashing briefly across his features, quickly masked by practiced control. "I wasn't expecting you to," he said, voice neutral, but the underlying tension betrayed him. Caspian allowed a measured pause, eyes scanning the assembled executives, projecting calm authority. Diana's heartbeat raced, but she remained composed, hands steady, mind razor-sharp, prepared to present data if prompted. Caspian began with routine procedural updates, speaking in a measured cadence that masked the strategic unraveling he was about to execute. Diana monitored reactions carefully, noting microexpressions and subtle shifts in posture. Then came the pivot. Caspian introduced the encrypted data from the flash drive, highlighting inconsistencies in reports, timestamps, and document origins that, when connected, revealed deliberate manipulation by the executive team. The boardroom shifted imperceptibly. The veneer of control began to crack. Executives whispered among themselves, eyes darting to the CEO, the realization dawning that their carefully constructed facade had been breached. Diana, prompted by Caspian, presented specific examples of altered financial reports, missing audit trails, and falsified internal communications. Each revelation landed with measured impact, precise and undeniable, leaving no room for obfuscation or denial. The CEO's face hardened, a mixture of anger, disbelief, and panic. Caspian's tone remained calm, methodical, but every word carried weight, exposing the chain of corruption and decisions made at the top. Diana added the corroborating files, uploading verified copies in real time to the company's secure server, ensuring that the evidence was immutable, accessible, and undeniable. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of projectors and computers, as the executives digested the implications. Finally, Caspian spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "The decisions made here are no longer concealed. The evidence demonstrates intentional wrongdoing at the highest level. The responsibility is clear, and so are the consequences. And before you consider a system wipe," Caspian added, his voice dropping to a dangerous chill, "know that an automated release has already been queued. If I don't check in with a secure server in 15 minutes, these same files will be live on every major financial news circuit in the country. You aren't just looking at evidence, you're looking at a countdown." Diana felt a surge of relief and pride. recognizing the courage it had taken for him to risk everything. Their partnership, forged under pressure and danger, had reached its ultimate test. The CEO's authority crumbled, the board's control dissolved, and in that silence, a new order began to emerge. Diana and Caspian had not only exposed corruption, but had done so with precision, integrity, and unwavering commitment to truth. The room, once a bastion of intimidation, now resonated with tension, accountability, and undeniable consequence. As the board members absorbed the impact, Diana and Caspian exchanged a glance, subtle but loaded with meaning. No words were necessary. Trust had been tested, loyalty proven, and the stakes survived. Outside the immediate chaos, a new path opened, one built not on fear, manipulation, or coercion, but on principle, courage, and shared resolve. The apex of risk had passed, and the first rays of real freedom, for both of them, began to pierce the long shadow of corporate control. The city had begun to wake fully, the morning lights spilling over streets, buildings, and quiet squares that had felt empty only hours before. Diana and Caspian walked side by side through the subdued rush of commuters, neither speaking at first. The weight of the last days, the infiltration, the nights of tension, the moral choices, the risk to reputation and freedom, had not yet fully dissipated, but it was softened by the quiet certainty of survival and victory. The corporate empire that had loomed over them, dictating fear and obedience, was no longer intact. Executives were under investigation, the CEO had resigned, and their evidence ensured that no cover-up could remain effective. Their destination was a small, modest building in a quieter district of the city, one they had secured as their new professional base. The sign above the door read "Nothing yet," blank and awaiting their vision. Inside, the space was simple but adaptable. High ceilings, wide windows, and room for desks, equipment, and planning boards. Caspian stepped in first, scanning the interior with a practiced eye, noting light angles, acoustics, and possible layouts. Diana followed, more slowly, letting the gravity of the moment sink in. For the first time, she was stepping into a space not dictated by orders, corporate greed, or surveillance. Every choice here would be theirs. They began unpacking and arranging materials, their movements fluid yet careful, aware that the calm was still fragile, that the outside world could intrude at any time. Yet the atmosphere was unlike any they had experienced under the corporate shadow. Here, control belonged to them. Decisions were final, and strategy was their own. Caspian paused, looking at Diana, a small, genuine smile crossing his features. "I think we need more than an office assistant," he said lightly. But the humor was real, human, and unforced. Diana laughed softly, the sound echoing faintly in the high-ceilinged room. It was a release, a signal that tension could exist alongside relief and hope. She reached for a stack of files, placing them carefully on a table, and their hands brushed, briefly, lightly, but the contact carried more meaning than any spoken words. Caspian caught her gaze, and in that moment, all pretense, calculation, and guardedness fell away. They were partners, not just in survival and strategy, but in something far deeper, unspoken, yet undeniably present. As the morning stretched on, they moved through plans, charts, and strategies, discussing how to launch their new agency, a firm dedicated to auditing, consulting, and investigative services. The skills they had honed under pressure, analysis, negotiation, strategic planning, risk assessment, would now serve clients ethically and purposefully. Every decision was deliberate, every word considered, but this time, the stakes were theirs to set, and the consequences theirs to manage. At last, they paused, sitting side by side at the table, hands still brushing occasionally over papers and office supplies. Diana exhaled, a sound mingling relief and wonder, realizing how far they had come. Caspian's voice broke the silence gently, almost intimate. "We did it. No one else dictated this. It's ours." Diana smiled, her fingers resting lightly over his. "Yes, ours," she agreed. And in that simple phrase lay everything. The trust forged under danger, the moral battles endured, the victories hard-earned, and the beginning of a life and work they had chosen together. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the battles fought within corporate walls and dark archives. But inside, Diana and Caspian had earned their freedom, agency, and purpose. They leaned back, sharing a quiet glance that needed no words. Every file, every plan, every risk had led to this moment. And as Caspian reached for his coffee, brushing Diana's hand once more, both knew that, finally, they were ready, not just to work, but to live together. Thank you for listening to the story. Write your thoughts in the comments.